Hola, muy buenas tardes. Hoy tenemos el honor de contar con el doctor Christopher Brown, director del Ashmolean Museum y miembro también del Worcester College, ambos pertenecientes a la Universidad de Oxford, una institución en la que también él es profesor de Historia del Arte. El señor Brown es uno de los grandes especialistas en pintura flamenca y holandesa del siglo XVII y en particular ha estudiado y escrito en profundidad sobre los artistas Rembrandt, Rubens y Van Dyck. Formado en la Universidad de Oxford y en el Courtauld Institute de la Universidad de Londres, con anterioridad trabajó en la National Gallery, también de esta ciudad, como conservador primero de pintura flamenca y holandesa y después como conservador jefe. En la actualidad y a partir de 1998 fue nombrado director de este museo, del Ashmolean, y es el cargo que ostenta hoy en día. Es comisario, bueno, aparte de participar como dentro de todo el programa de exposiciones temporales de este museo, está inmerso en un proceso de remodelación de las colecciones y del espacio que él mismo comentará ahora. La conferencia de hoy precisamente será de uno de los artistas en los que más ha trabajado, que es Rembrandt y el realismo, y tratará la naturaleza artística del realismo en este maestro, precisamente de lo real, y los matices de una representación más emocional que descriptiva. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in the Prado. It's a particular pleasure to be speaking in this new auditorium, in this wonderful new extension. I came a month ago to the opening of the extension, this beautiful building by Rafael Moneo, and it really is a very great pleasure to be here speaking. Can everybody hear me? Are we all? Good. I thought I would just begin my remarks, my talk, by saying a word about the Ashmolean Museum in the hope that you will visit my museum soon in Oxford before we get on to Rembrandt. I just thought I would mention to you that the Ashmolean Museum, which is part of the University of Oxford, was founded in 1683, which makes it, of course, very much older than the Prado. I think of the Prado as a small child compared to the Ashmolean. And we sit in a very large neo-Greek building in Beaumont Street in Oxford. And at the moment, this is perhaps not the right moment to visit. We have a very large extension also being built in Oxford. However, that extension will be completed by November 2009, and I look forward to welcoming you all in Oxford at that time. There are major international collections of archaeology, of Eastern and Western art. I would like to be able to tell you that we had a major collection of works by Rembrandt, and indeed we do. We have drawings and etchings, but no painting. The last painting that we thought was by Rembrandt, I'm afraid, has proved not to be so. Anyway, come please to the Ashmolean in the future. My subject this evening is Rembrandt and realism. In the Gemälde Gallery, is everybody sitting down? I want to get everybody sitting down. Are we all sitting? Good. Right. In the Gemälde Gallery, in the painting gallery in Dresden, in Germany, there is a large canvas painted by Rembrandt in 1635, which shows a child being abducted by an eagle. There it is on the screen. The bird has grasped the child's robe and its right arm in its beak, while its right leg, the bird's right leg, pinions the child's left arm. It is already carrying the child high above a wooded, hilly landscape with a ruined building, which you can just make out in the bottom left-hand corner here. The child, a boy who clutches a bunch of cherries in his left hand, is wearing a richly embroidered tunic with an elaborate tassel. The child is terrified. He is pissing with fear, his face contorted as he cries for help. You can see, I think, what is happening here. So fearful is the child. This is a highly ambitious work by Rembrandt. The canvas is large, 1.6 meters high, 1.3 meters wide. And Rembrandt indicated how important it was, and I think how pleased he was with it, by signing the painting in a very prominent position on the edge of the child's robe. It's just here. His signature, it says Rembrandt Fake It, so Rembrandt made this 1635, a very prominent position on the edge of the child's robe, just beneath the eye of the eagle, more or less in the dead center of the composition. And this is significant. It's worth pausing over for a moment, as the usual convention of the time was to sign a painting towards the bottom or in the corner of the canvas. Now, this is not the representation of a horrifying scene witnessed by Rembrandt as he walked in the countryside outside the walls of Amsterdam. As the child's rich and archaic dress reveals, it is a scene from classical literature. It's the abduction of Ganymede. Jupiter, assuming the form of an eagle, abducted the beautiful boy Ganymede, a prince of Troy, and took him to Mount Olympus, where he became Jupiter's cupbearer. The story is told by Homer in the Iliad, by Virgil in the Aeneid, and by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. For Rembrandt, the literary source from which he took the story is likely to have been a book by Karel van Mander, a Dutch painter and theorist, his explanation of the Metamorphoses of Ovid, a section of his book of painting, which was published in Amsterdam in 1618, just 17 years before Rembrandt painted this picture. And in this book, in the book of painting by Van Mander, deliberately addressed to artists, there is a long account of the story of Ganymede. There was a well-established iconographic tradition for the treatment of this subject, from which Rembrandt's depiction differs in a number of very significant respects. Unsurprisingly, the strong homoerotic aspect of this subject appealed to Michelangelo. And the single best known and most influential depiction of this subject is his drawing of about 1533. This is the drawing by Michelangelo, 1533, in which Ganymede is shown as a young man rather than as a child. He's a well-muscled adult who's firmly grasped by the eagle, but rather than expressing fear, his eyes are closed and he is accepting, if not actually welcoming, his fate. Ganymede is a traveler, and his dog and his stick you can just make out here. His dog and his stick, to which his meager possessions are attached, can just be made out on the ground beneath him. The drawing, which is in the Fogg Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which after the Ashmolean is the second or third best university museum in the world, that's where the drawing is, but it was widely distributed in the 16th century, principally in the form of a print by Nicolas Bétrisset. It's copied it reappears in many forms. So, and I choose just 3 of them. On the left-hand side, a print by an Antwerp printmaker, Cornelis Bos, after a drawing by Michael Coxey. So, as you can see, very strongly influenced by Michelangelo's depiction of this subject. Must have been done very shortly after the Michelangelo drawing, so in the mid to late 1530s. On the right, a painting by Damiano Mazza of the late 1660s, in which the figure is reversed, but it seems to me to depend very strongly in type on the Michelangelo. And finally, at the top, very interesting depiction of the subject by Girolamo da Carpi, about 10 years after Michelangelo's drawing, which is from the castle in Ferrara. Comes from Ferrara, but is today in Dresden. So, enormously influential, Michelangelo's invention. It was widely distributed in the form of the Beatrice print throughout Europe, and we find echoes of it in Brussels, in Ferrara, and elsewhere. Benvenuto Cellini's Ganymede of a few years later, of 1548, was a different interpretation, quite a different interpretation, based on an antique torso, but similarly it stresses the beauty of the boy. While Rubens' treatment of about 1611, again, it seems to me to very clearly acknowledge Michelangelo as its source, but rather than showing the moment of abduction, has a beautiful adult Ganymede languorously resting on the eagle's wing while offering wine to 2 goddesses, usually thought to be Juno and Hebe. And finally, the Dutch classicist Nicolaas van der Helst-Stockhade, painting in about 1660, shows a beautiful boy kissing Jupiter in what is most literally the most literally homoerotic, and yet actually it seems to be very cold and unsensual treatment of this subject. Rembrandt must have been aware of many of these versions of the subject, particularly, of course, of the Michelangelo. And yet he deliberately ignored them. He went back to Van Mander's text, he read and reread it carefully, and he tried to imagine how this event might actually have happened. How would a real child react to the terrifying experience of being seized by an eagle? Rembrandt had never seen such a horrifying sight, and yet he had seen a child struggling in its mother's arms, and he based the treatment of Ganymede on his observation of mothers and children. Here, I show you on the left, very beautiful pen and wash drawing by Rembrandt of around 1635, so about exactly the same date as the Ganymede, observed evidently from the life, a drawing which is now in Berlin. And it was on such drawings that he based his treatment of the abduction of Ganymede. He made many drawings of mothers and children from life, some, of course, from his own family, and the inventory of his possessions, which was made at the time of Rembrandt's bankruptcy in 1656, specifically mentions a large group of drawings under just this heading. This drawing, which was made, which is now in Berlin, as I said, was made shortly before the painting, but is not dated. However, in the same year as the painting, in the etching that he made on the right-hand screen, this is an etching of 1635. You can see it's dated here, exactly the same year as the Ganymede painting. Rembrandt shows a child here on the ground, screwing his face up in precisely the same way as Ganymede does, when, as you can see, a dog tries to steal his pancake. And he continued, Rembrandt, to make such observations throughout his life. As late as 1658, we can see this wonderful, wonderful drawing in Dresden of a mother supporting her child as he pisses in the street. Rembrandt's preliminary drawing for the painting in Dresden for the abduction of Ganymede shows the child being abducted from its parents. Here are the parents in the bottom left-hand corner. They're shown distraught, and they are an element in the composition that Rembrandt suppressed when he came to paint the picture itself. And he substitutes, as I showed as we looked at the painting at the beginning, he substitutes a ruined building, which he no doubt thought more appropriate for his classical subject. And here it is, you see in the bottom. He takes out the parents and puts in a piece of loosely classical architecture. The abduction of Ganymede, this painting in Dresden, reveals the true nature of Rembrandt's realism. It was not the literal description of reality, although there is literal description of imagined historical detail, but emotional realism, the attempt to imagine what these events were truly like, and so to enable the viewer to understand and even to enter into the emotions of the participants. He painted traditional subjects from classical literature and the Bible, and yet he deliberately rejected Italianate idealism in favor of a realism based on his observation of daily life around him. And that daily life, as we have seen, he recorded in the first place in the form of drawings. Now, it has sometimes been thought that in paintings like The Abduction of Ganymede, what Rembrandt is doing is mocking the classical Italian tradition. However, there is absolutely no evidence at all for this view. Indeed, there is no evidence that Rembrandt was anything but respectful towards classical and Renaissance art. There are, of course, well-known examples of his making drawn copies after Italian art, notably after Leonardo's Last Supper. This will be familiar to you. This is the drawing in Berlin, which, as you can see, is signed. He was very pleased with this drawing. He signed it very prominently, Rembrandt Fecit, 1635. Significantly, again, the year that we're talking about, the year of the Ganymede. So he's undoubtedly thinking about classical art. He's thinking about Italian art at that moment. And he makes a whole series of drawings after the Last Supper. And even, of course, he draws very profound inspiration from Italian art. For example, this etching of the mother and child, of course, very closely modeled on a composition by Andrea Mantegna. And yet, Rembrandt's rejection of the idealizing, non-realistic tradition of Italian art was, in my mind, deliberate and very deep-seated. Unlike many of his 16th century Netherlandish predecessors, and indeed many of his contemporaries, Rembrandt never traveled to Italy, although both his teachers had done so. His conscious rejection of Michelangelo's famous interpretation of the Ganymede story calls to mind a passage in the autobiography of a man called Constantijn Huygens, not an easy Dutch name to hold in the mind, Constantijn Huygens, secretary and artistic advisor to successive princes of Orange in The Hague in the early 17th century. And Huygens wrote his autobiography in 1630. Constantijn Huygens had visited the young Rembrandt in his studio in Leiden in the previous year, in 1629. and was hugely impressed by his work, particularly by the artist's ability to depict heightened states of emotion in a convincing manner. The painting which was on the easel when Huygens went into Rembrandt's studio in 1629 during his visit was this one on the left-hand screen, Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver, which is in a private collection in England, though it's on loan to the National Gallery in London. He especially admired Constantin Huygens as he was writing about this picture. Remember, he's writing about this picture in 1630, so having just seen it on the easel in the Leiden studio of Rembrandt, he writes about it and he says how much he admires the figure of Judas. And I quote, "The gesture of that one despairing Judas, not to mention all the other impressive pictures in the painting, that one maddened Judas, screaming, begging for forgiveness, but devoid of hope, all traces of hope erased from his face. His gaze," and I show you in the detail, you can see this, I think, very well, his gaze wild, his hair torn out by the roots. You can see his scalp is actually bleeding because he's ripped out his hair, an extraordinarily realistic detail, which of course follows the biblical text. His hair torn out by the roots, his garments rent, his arms contorted, his hands clenched until they bleed. A blind impulse has brought him to his knees, his whole body writhing in pitiful hideousness. All this I compare with all the beauty that has been produced through the ages. This is a very important account of Rembrandt. There are very few accounts of Rembrandt by his contemporaries, and this is one of the fullest descriptions we have of the way in which a very sophisticated 17th century observer would have looked at Rembrandt's work. Huygens also admired the dramatic representation of classical and biblical subjects in the work of the artist who he considered to be the greatest living painter, Rubens. So he's very, very interested in Rubens. He's very admiring of Rubens, but he's excited and thrilled by seeing for the first time the work of this brilliant young Dutch artist in Leiden, Rembrandt. And Huygens lavishes extravagant praise upon Rembrandt. And he writes, "All honor to you, Rembrandt. To transport Troy, indeed all Asia, to Italy is a lesser achievement than to heap the laurels of Greece and Italy on the Dutch, the achievement of a Dutchman who has never ventured outside the walls of his native city." So he's saying how extraordinary, what an extraordinary achievement this is in an artist who's never traveled outside Leiden. It wasn't entirely true because Rembrandt had been to Amsterdam, but he certainly hadn't been further than Amsterdam. And yet, also very interestingly, Huygens feels that Rembrandt lacked polish and refinement. And to this end, he suggests that Rembrandt and his fellow artist, Jan Lievens, another young artist working closely with Rembrandt in Leiden, that both these young Dutch artists should travel to Italy and study the work of Raphael and Michelangelo. And in this way, they should complete their artistic education. How I would welcome, Huygens writes, how I would welcome their acquaintance with Raphael and Michelangelo, the feasting of their eyes on the creations of such gigantic spirits. How quickly they would surpass them all, giving Italians due cause to come to Holland. This is a very interesting nationalistic point of view. How quickly they would surpass them all, giving Italians due cause to come to Holland. If only these men, born to raise art to its highest pinnacle, knew themselves better. And he clearly, in the course of the conversation with these two young artists in Leiden, Huygens must have said this to them. He said, I very much admire your work, but in order to complete your training, to complete your artistic education, you should travel to Italy and look particularly at the work of the artists of the Italian High Renaissance. And this was very conventional advice. This is exactly what many generations of Dutch artists had done. So it was absolutely the conventional thing to say. And Huygens records the response of these two young artists, Rembrandt and Jan Lievens. And he's evidently extremely surprised by what they say. They say, we are too busy to go to Holland, to Italy. We're too busy to travel to Italy. And anyway, most of the best Italian art is in the Netherlands. Now, this was the second part of this reply is clearly facetious. There was indeed quite a vigorous art market. There were some Italian pictures in Amsterdam at that time, but really this was clearly essentially a facetious reply. But their point was absolutely clear and evidently a well thought out position. And their position was they did not think it necessary to travel to Italy to complete their artistic education, as many previous generations of Netherlandish artists had done. They considered that their education had been finished in the studio of their teacher, Peter Lastman, in Amsterdam. They had both trained with Lastman in Amsterdam, and now they were eager to begin their careers in earnest. Excuse these illustrations from a book. They've caught the light, I'm afraid. Constantine Huygens put his patron's money where his mouth was. That's to say, he put the money of the Prince of Orange, whose patron, who he was working for. He commissioned from Rembrandt a series of paintings of the Passion of Christ for the Prince of Orange. And these paintings, and I show you two of them, the Entombment and the Resurrection, both paintings on quite a modest scale, both today in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. He commissioned from Rembrandt a series of paintings of the Passion which concentrate on the drama of the Passion, much of which is expressed in the form of the horrified reactions shown on the faces of the onlookers. And it's in connection with this extremely interesting commission. There were eventually 6 paintings in this series. I'm just showing 2 of them now. And in this, in connection with this commission, the commission from Constantine Huygens for the Passion series, from the to hang in the chapel of the Prince of Orange in The Hague. It's in this connection that Rembrandt makes the only significant remark that he ever is recorded to have made, that he makes in his own voice about his own art. We have many observations about Rembrandt's way of working from pupils and from contemporary critics, but all we have, very frustratingly, is this one sentence, this one phrase in a letter. We only have 7 surviving letters by Rembrandt. He very rarely, it seems, wrote letters, and most of them are in connection with this particular commission. And it's in one of these letters that he says that he is depicting these subjects, he's showing these subjects from the Passion of Christ with, and I will just give you the Dutch, the Dutch phrase is de meeste en de natuureelste bewegelijkheid, which may puzzle you for a moment. I will explain. As befits Rembrandt's only authentic statement about his own art, this phrase, as you may imagine, has been endlessly discussed. Books have been written about these few words. Now, for our purposes, it's clear, or it's clear to me, and you will have to take my word for it, that what he's referring to here is the naturalistic depiction of heightened emotional states. And so we might translate this as the greatest and most natural emotion, which of course is exactly what we see in the figures who are reacting, particularly in the Resurrection, these figures, these terrified soldiers at the Resurrection, or the figures around the tomb of Christ who are reacting intensely to the subject, to these extraordinary events. Or, of course, also it calls to mind the figure again of Judas from the 20 pieces of silver. I mean, it's that sense of telling the story and introducing the viewer into these heightened emotional states by the way that they're depicted in forms of often apparently almost exaggerated reactions to the events. And the fact that Rembrandt uses the word naturelste is extremely interesting in this context. Now, realism, and I'm sure this has been pointed out before in this lecture series, is not a word that we find in 17th century vocabularies. It's certainly not a word we find in Dutch vocabulary of the 17th century. And in its present use as a term in the discussion of art, realism is a coinage of the French 19th century. However, the term naturel is often used by Dutch writers, and it has the same meaning as natural in English, which is broadly, I think, synonymous with realistic in modern critical language. In Rembrandt's phrase, it means the convincing representation of a scene and of the emotions expressed by individual figures within it. Convincing, and this is at the heart of the point I want to make to you this evening, convincing because recognizable as genuine human responses. Convincing because such expressions can be seen on the faces of men and women in everyday life, and so clearly convey to the viewer the emotions of, say, anger or happiness. Rembrandt enjoyed great early success, and he moved in the winter of 1631 from his provincial hometown of Leiden to the metropolis of Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, he was inundated with portrait commissions. It's extremely important to remember when thinking about Rembrandt that his first reputation in Leiden, amongst connoisseurs such as Constantine Huygens, who I've discussed at some length, his first reputation was as a painter of highly dramatic, highly charged, intensely naturalistic scenes from the Bible and classical history and literature. But his second reputation, his subsequent reputation after his arrival in Amsterdam in the winter of 1631, was as a portrait painter, admired enormously for his ability to render his sitters in 3 dimensions, modelling their heads and features by the subtle use of shadows. And I've there chosen 2 of his very finest portraits from this period. The portrait of the remonstrant preacher, Johannes Altenburgat, which is 1632 in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and the portrait of Martin Luton from the same year. So he comes to Amsterdam and then establishes his great reputation as a portrait painter. However, and he paints really a large number of portraits in those years. The years 32 to 34, he almost exclusively paints portraits. He makes a great reputation. He makes a lot of money, and he's able to, of course, dream of buying the house that eventually bankrupted him. However, he becomes extremely ambitious, and flushed with this early success as a portrait painter in Amsterdam, Rembrandt goes back to his first love, to the painting of classical and biblical scenes. His confidence and his ambition were soaring, and he believed at that moment, in the mid-1630s, that almost single-handedly he could create a market in such paintings of classical religious subjects, on a very large scale and in a highly realistic style. Now, the model for the scale and also for his subject matter was undoubtedly Rubens, who was enjoying enormous success in these years in the 1630s in Antwerp, supplying the courts of Europe, I mean not least the Spanish court, with large and ambitious paintings. And yet, and I do think again I want to underline this point, Rubens' approach to his subject matter was profoundly different from that of Rubens. And I think there is no more telling comparison in this respect than between Rembrandt's Ganymede, which I've discussed earlier, Rembrandt's Ganymede of 1635, and Rubens' canvas here in the Prado, Rubens' canvas of the same subject. There it is on the right-hand screen, painted for, of course, Philip IV's Torre de la Parada, the king's hunting lodge, painted at just the same time, just exactly the same moment, well, perhaps a year later, perhaps 1636, so just in the middle years of the 1630s. Now, Rubens is very often cited as the model for Rembrandt. And indeed, in his ambition and his very, his princely, almost quasi-princely style of life, there's no doubt that Rembrandt was hugely impressed by Rubens and did indeed have him in mind as a model. But if you look at this particular comparison, it shows fundamentally divergent approaches to the representations of the representation of a classical subject. Rembrandt, on the left, has attempted to convey to the viewer the dramatic circumstances of Ganymede's abduction as he imagined them to be. The boy's sheer terror, his involuntary pissing, the pain caused by the eagle's tight grip. But Rubens, on the right-hand side, very much, it seems to me, in the spirit of Michelangelo, depicts a perfectly proportioned adolescent being wafted up to Olympus, eager to take on his new role as cupbearer to Jupiter. The abduction of Ganymede is only one of a series of large canvases of biblical and classical subjects which Rembrandt painted in the same manner in the mid-1630s. So remember, again, he comes from Leiden to Amsterdam, has these years of huge success as a portrait painter, painting the elite of Amsterdam, returns to the idea of history painting, the painting of classical and biblical subjects. And then there's a very large group of pictures, all of which come from these years. They include this painting of Bellona, the goddess of war, a painting now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They include your picture here in the Prado, which I see the label presently says is Artemisia, though it's also sometimes called Sophonisba. It really is extremely difficult to know which of these two. It's either Sophonisba taking the poison or Artemisia, who, as you know, had the misfortune to swallow her husband's ashes. There's also, from the same period, the great Danae in St. Petersburg, which has an extremely interesting history, and about which you can invite me back and give another lecture. This is the Danae, which has a very complex history, having been begun in 1635, and then Rembrandt returns to it a number of years later. Then, of course, the Belshazzar's Feast in the National Gallery in London, also from 1635. Abraham's Sacrifice on the right-hand screen, also from 1635. And again, there are many of these. Samson threatening his father-in-law, and perhaps the most dramatic and certainly the most bloodthirsty of them all, the blinding of Samson of 1636, the great picture on an enormous scale, on a heroic scale, which is in the museum in Frankfurt. These are all on a very large scale. They're all on, you know the Artemisia, and they're on a very large scale, and they're all painted, interestingly, on canvas. The little Judas, the smaller Judas, was painted on panel, on an oak panel. They're all painted on a large scale. They're all painted realistically in the sense that the details are precise and are as historically accurate as Rembrandt was able to make them. Look, for example, at the ornate scabbard here, from which Abraham has just taken his knife, or look also at his slipper. These are very realistic details with the kind of historical imagination that Rembrandt brought to such subjects. Or look at the very rich robe of Belshazzar, and the temple vessel, which Belshazzar has knocked over, has overturned in his astonishment at seeing the prediction of his own death written by the hand of God. I mean, this is naturalistic detail, realistic detail of a kind with which we're familiar in other Dutch painting of the 17th century. Indeed, it is perhaps the defining characteristic of Dutch painting of the 17th century. And yet, in my mind, what is far more significant and the source of Rembrandt's great and enduring distinction as a painter of biblical and classical subjects is the emotional realism which I have stressed in my discussion of the abduction of Ganymede. It is Rembrandt's intention to bring these scenes to life for a contemporary audience by inviting the viewer to enter into the drama through understanding the emotions of the participants. We think, for example, Artemisia's dilemma, Belshazzar's horrified realization of his imminent fate, Abraham, here in the great picture in Munich, Abraham torn between duty to God and paternal love, Samson outraged, as he was here, outraged at the deception which has been practiced upon him, and of course Samson pinned down here by the Philistine soldiers, and this extraordinary figure of the triumphant Delilah, who holds his hair in her hand. Not only are these scenes highly, compellingly dramatic, they are also, in the context of 17th century Amsterdam, highly original. No other artist in the city was working on this scale and with this degree of emotional realism. The Blinding of Samson, this painting, appears to have been intended as a gift for Constantine Huygens to thank him for his role in obtaining the Passion series commission for Rembrandt. But it's extremely interesting, we do not know of any patrons for the other paintings. Rembrandt must have imagined that within the prosperous elite of Amsterdam, many of whom had sat to him for their portraits, there were connoisseurs, or liefhebbers in the contemporary Dutch, connoisseurs who would buy these paintings and hang them in their houses. And in this, he seems to have been disappointed. Because how else can we explain the fact that at the end of the 1630s, so after this intense period of these large dramatic history paintings, at the end of the 1630s, the format of his biblical and classical paintings becomes smaller, and he chooses to depict less emotionally intense subjects. His production of large-scale dramatic paintings from the mid-1630s is only a brief moment in Rembrandt's career. And the reasons for its abandonment would seem to be that a significant market for such paintings could not be found in Amsterdam at that moment. And it's very interesting that by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1630s, Rembrandt is painting in quite a different manner. And I would just like you to make this remarkable comparison. Here, these are very large paintings, life-size figures, highly dramatic, as you can see. By the end of the 1630s, he has moved from the violence and drama of the Blinding of Samson to the quiet, meditative atmosphere. Here, this is the Noli Me Tangere of 1638, or indeed to the Woman Taken in Adultery of 1641. Smaller paintings with a far smaller figure canon. So a very significant shift in scale, a very significant shift in mood, and yet not a significant shift, it seems to me, in the artist's basic intention, which continued to be the realistic, convincing, and engaging for the audience portrayal of biblical subjects. In his ambition to persuade Amsterdammers to buy his large-scale biblical and classical paintings, Rembrandt was in advance of his times. By the 1660s, such paintings would indeed hang in Amsterdam interiors. This reflects not only a change in taste, but also the fact that Amsterdam houses from the 1650s onwards were being built on a larger scale than previously, creating internal spaces which could accommodate far bigger pictures. And we see a nice example of that here, a prosperous Amsterdam interior by Pieter de Hoogh. This must have been painted, obviously painted after his move from Delft to Amsterdam in about 1661. So this is painted about 1665, this interior. And it shows in this prosperous Amsterdam interior with, as you can see, Spanish leather on the walls. But above the fireplace, here's the fireplace, above the fireplace, a very large painting of, guess which subject, of, as you can see, the abduction of Ganymede, based very clearly, very closely on the Rembrandt original. Now, this painting, we know what it is because of this print that was made after it. This is a painting, as it happens, by Karel van Mander III, so a descendant of Karel van Mander, whose account of the abduction of Ganymede Rembrandt had read in the Book of Painting, but obviously based on Rembrandt's painting, done substantially later, of course, and hanging above the fireplace in a rich interior in a painting by Pieter de Hoogh, painting incidentally in Lisbon. So what was it then? I think the question we can ask is, what was it then that caused Rembrandt to so decisively reject the Italian and Flemish traditions in favour of a far more realistic portrayal of such scenes? I think let's go back, let's keep with Rembrandt. Dutch art of the 17th century is essentially realistic, essentially secular. It's the new art of a new young country with new subject matter such as landscape, genre painting, still life, and marine painting, treated in a manner which broadly reflects observed reality. That said, 17th century realism sits within the existing northern artistic heritage. Michelangelo had famously mocked northern artists for their unimaginative, literal depictions of material reality. And Rembrandt was undoubtedly conscious of his position within this proud, non-Italianate tradition. His program, however, was to apply the same naturalism to biblical and classical subjects that his northern predecessors had applied to the description of landscape. If such subjects were to live and breathe for his contemporaries, he believed, it must be possible to picture them in the guise of familiar life with its familiar emotions. Rembrandt's religious art is profoundly Protestant in character. There has been endless discussion about the precise nature of Rembrandt's religious belief. The current consensus seems to be that he was not formally affiliated to any particular confession, and yet he certainly had a deep religious faith. He had important contacts within the Mennonite community in his first years in Amsterdam. largely through his dealer, Hendrik Eulenburg, Saskia, his wife's cousin, and himself, Eulenburg, a Mennonite. However, Rembrandt's faith may well have been closer in character to the Remonstrant, which is to say the liberal wing of the Dutch Reformed Church. The realistic depiction of the ministry and passion of Christ, which we see in Rembrandt's most profound religious works of his middle years, and particularly, and of course I can't help choosing these marvellous examples, particularly in his great etchings of the 1640s and 1650s. And here, of course, is the Ecce Homo, the presentation of Christ, in the great, and also the crucifixion, two of the profoundest etchings of those years. These are clearly closely related to Protestant belief and practice. At the most simple level, the Protestant emphasis on the constant private reading of the Bible translated into the vernacular and personal meditation on these texts are also reflected in Rembrandt's recreation of them in convincing scenes. The Dutch Republic, and this is an important point to remember, the Dutch Republic had undoubtedly the highest literacy rates in early modern Europe. And the experience of carefully reading a passage in the Dutch State's Bible, or of carefully studying in the hand a Rembrandt etching of the same subject, was clearly intended to be a very closely comparable experience. It is, I believe, very significant that the subject of an old woman reading from the Dutch Bible is frequently painted by Rembrandt, especially in his early years. This may well reflect the circumstances of his own family. His mother, who converted from Catholicism to the Dutch Reformed Church when she married Rembrandt's father, Herman Gerritzoon van Rijn, is always said to have been very devout. I mean, friends remark on this, and to have spent much time in reading and meditating on the scriptures. Towards the end of his life, Rembrandt became more economical in describing religious subjects. Gone are the bystanders whose faces have to be studied for their reactions to the drama. And instead there is a far greater concentration on the drama itself. The Joseph's Blessing, the great painting in Kassel, 1655, a return to a much larger format, so a return to these large canvas paintings of the similar in scale to the paintings that I've been talking about, the paintings of the mid-1630s. The Joseph's Blessing focuses closely on the central drama of the Joseph and Jacob scene, and yet includes Esau, the rejected brother, and Asenath, the boy's mother. That's her on the right-hand side. Rembrandt tells the story in an emotionally lower key than he might have done 20 years before, but no less realistically. However, a dozen years later, when painting The Return of the Prodigal Son, the great painting, again on a heroic scale, in the Hermitage, The Return of the Prodigal Son, there is in this work an absolute concentration on the central drama of the embrace of father and son. Onlookers have been virtually excluded. There's no architectural or real spatial setting. This time, literal realism has been sacrificed to dramatic power, but emotional realism, in its most pared-down form, characterizes this large canvas, which is one of Rembrandt's final and most profound meditations on a biblical text. Thank you very much.